I remember when I was a school child, and I sat in class and the teacher talked about America being a melting pot. That people came from all over the world and, like a ball of wax, melted together into an American culture. A unique American culture of rugged individualism, where people rejected government intervention in the name of freedom. It said it right there on the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, give me your sick, give me your poor, yearning to be free. And people would come all over the world to America for the Bill of Rights, for freedom of speech, for the right to bear arms, the right to peacefully protest, the right to be able to earn a living, to get a job, make money, keep their money, and live their American dream. To not be spied on by the government. People came to America and they melted into a very unique culture defined by individual liberty and freedom. But just a few years after that, when I was still very young, still a school child, I remember a teacher said to me, America's not a melting pot. America is more like a salad bowl. And you have your lettuce and you have your tomatoes and red peppers and avocados. And America is more defined as people who come all over the world and bring and keep their own unique cultures. And keeping your own culture to a degree is fine, but completely rejecting the culture of the country you just arrived in, well, that could be problematic. And at the time, I didn't understand what was happening, but looking back, I now know there was a top-down push to erode classic American culture, the very culture that created the American dream, that people can make their own money and start their own business and become independent outside of government, very successful, that people can have freedom of speech and the right to peacefully protest and the right to bear arms and the right to fair trials, to not be spied on by the government because, well, the government works for you, you don't work for the government, so if the government's working for you, why would they be spying on you? This classic American culture was being eroded and it was coming from the top down. And you see it today through this concept of cultural appropriation, right? You get these powerful left-wing media personalities and these politicians who say that if you adopt any part of someone else's culture, that you've done something wrong, that you have appropriated their culture, as if, for example, as if you have to be Mexican to open a Mexican restaurant, as if an ethnicity has a patent, has property rights over an idea. I mean, you want to talk about racist. I mean, imagine telling someone of Mexican descent, telling someone of Middle Eastern descent that they weren't allowed to appropriate any European or North American culture. Well, given that almost the large majority of inventions and human innovation and human history, and you can look this up, comes from North America and European cultures. It would essentially be telling people from South America, people from Africa, that they have to live like it's hundreds of years ago, which is, of course, horribly racist and terrible, but it's the same thing. But they introduced this concept of cultural appropriation, and they say, well, if you adopt any part of another ethnicity's culture, then you have wronged them, you have done something wrong. When, of course, this is the farthest thing from the truth. I mean, if you're a white person and you open a Mexican restaurant, well, imitation is the greatest form of flattery. That's basically telling a Mexican person that you love their culture so much that you want to devote your life to opening a restaurant and spreading that Mexican culture, spreading the joys of Mexican food to people who otherwise might not get to experience it. This is not a bad thing, this cultural appropriation. This is the greatest form of respect. But the reason they push this narrative of cultural appropriation is because they don't want people to become a melting pot. They want people to remain divided. That this is what Mexican people do and this is how they act. That this is what American people do and this is how they act. This is what African people do or African Americans do and this is how they act. And the purpose behind this is to prevent people from becoming a melting pot, from appreciating each other's culture. And if you don't appreciate each other's culture, by the very nature you become combative with one another. This is a method of divide and conquer so that these left-wing politicians can keep people divided and use that division to claim everyone else is racist, that other cultures are out to get you, because if you're not appreciating each other's culture, by the very nature, you are weary of one another's culture. And then they tell people to see these microaggressions, that to teach people that people who are different than them are racist against them, even if they're not outwardly showing it. Don't worry. By their inner thoughts, and you could read their mind, they're racist. And the idea behind all of these concepts is to keep people divided. And then, of course, it does something else. It prevents people from adopting classical American culture and the aspects of it that made America the richest, most prosperous place in the world. I mean, at one point, before the Great Society, before the 1965 immigration bill, the United States of America literally had half of the wealth in the world. This classical culture of individual liberty, of freedom of speech, of this concept that people can work and keep their own money without government intervention, that people can own their own property, could own the rights to their own goods and services, and they can make voluntary interactions with whoever they want. As long as there's not force involved, if I have a product that I own and I want to sell it to you, that's great. I give it to you, you give me the money, the government doesn't intervene. And this system, this idea of freedom, led to more prosperity, the erosion of poverty on a level the world had never seen before. But the big oligarchs at the top who wanted to take control, well, they had to erode this system of poverty. So they started to create these concepts like cultural appropriation and microaggressions. And the idea is to get people to look to government to protect them rather than look to freedom to protect them, when freedom has always been the greatest protective force. And as a result, people no longer melt, so to speak, into that classical American culture. And as a result, politicians use these concepts of cultural appropriation and microaggressions, having everyone so weary of anyone that looks different than them, thinking that anyone who looks different must hate them. They're dehumanized. You could read their inner thoughts and you know they're racist. And as a result of these concepts, these big oligarchs, these leftist politicians, and many of the right-wing politicians, because it's all just controlled opposition, have been able to convince people to erode basic American liberties because they think that the government is protecting them, whether that's through the welfare state or hate speech, the government partnering with corporations, YouTube censoring people for hate speech. But all of this is just designed to erode liberty. And then these politicians come along and say that we have to have open borders. And we have to let people come in from the third world who haven't adopted these, really haven't been exposed to these classical American values. And then when they get here, on top of you having to let them come, we are going to teach them that there's this concept of cultural appropriation, and that they shouldn't adopt American culture, and that Americans shouldn't adopt their culture. And that there's this concept of microaggressions, and that even if someone's not outwardly showing it, people who have a different skin color, they hate you. And that there's this concept of white privilege, and that white people have all this privilege and white people hate you, and because of that, you should hate them. And then these left-wing politicians criticize Native Americans, people that are here, who are against this open border policy, when it's an open border policy in combination with teaching people to hate classical American values and to hate the native population. It's quite literally a cultural takeover. And that's why all of these concepts are introduced. And until all of these concepts are introduced, these concepts that lead people to voting for more government power, voting for the welfare state, which erodes the American dream, voting to give the government authority to violate people's property rights, the foundation of the American dream, that the government will tax people at high rates, and if people resist, they'll be thrown in a prison cell because the government has a monopoly over force, and that your property will be stolen from the government and redistributed to people who just arrived from the third world, who are taught not to accept American culture and join the melting pot, but are taught to hate American culture through these concepts of cultural appropriation, through these concepts of microaggressions, through these concepts of white privilege. And when you put all of these concepts together along with the open borders, understand that everything that made America great, that American culture, which means America because we are our culture. If you take all the people out of Japan who are Japanese and replace them with Mexicans, it's no longer Japan, and it will quickly devolve into Mexico, and I do mean devolve. So when you put all these concepts together and you have the open borders, American culture is quite literally being conquered. America is quite literally being conquered. See, it's not just war. You could be conquered by more ways than war. You could be conquered through subversion. You could be conquered from culture. And anytime any civilization is being conquered, their people have a right to fight back.